loves that goat, doesn't he?
Some would say a little too much.
Jacob, wow, it's great to see you. Why are you here?
Paying my grandpa's tab. Apparently he was an alcoholic, which is probably why he's dead right now.
So, how are we feeling?
Yeah, everything's great. Keeping busy. Wine cream has not filled the void. Yet.
Let's go out together. Meet some other guys.
I made a huge mistake when I broke up with Olivia.
No one asked you to go and talk to her. Alright, you should have hit him and run away like a normal ex-boyfriend.
I'm totally okay. Absolutely no soul-crushing regrets that keep me up at night. What even is a soul-crushing regret, right? I don't know, because I never had one.
I've really been hurting this last month, and you've used tonight as an excuse to try and get with some guy.
I would have given you one, or even two if you want to make that, Chinese finger trap thing.
What is
happen.
wrong with you?
Because if you love someone, you gotta tell them. And I know that people hurt each other in this crazy mixed up world, but you just gotta decide who's worth hurting for.
So, where does the goat come into all of this?
Abby, it's called setting the scene. Read a book.
Jacob.
Sky.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, today we are joined by actor, director, producer extraordinaire Tom Danger. We're here to talk about his brand new movie, Sweethurt, which comes out very soon. Say hello to everybody, Tom.
Hello, what a lovely intro. I've never been introduced as actor, writer, director, producer before. I feel good.
Hey, you did it all on this film. You wrote the film with a little bit of help from Logan Webster. You do have a role in the film as a bartender, and you are the director of the film. Can you talk a little bit about it and tell people what it's about and how it goes? I mean, I just saw the movie, so I know what it's about.
So basically, my hetero life mate, Logan Webster, and I were a big fan of comedy, and previously I had made a horror film. He'd also made a horror film. But we both realized that we're both extremely funny people, and so hey, maybe we should make a comedy as well. So that was kind of the genesis, just us wanting to write a film together. But the movie itself, Sweethurt, we modeled it after late 90s, early 2000s comedies that we both grew up loving and watching. The films of Kevin Smith, like Chasing Amy, and Clerks, and other films like 80s teen romance, like The Breakfast Club, Say Anything, and also those movies like American Pie, Empire Records, Can't Hardly Wait. A lot of those movies, I don't know, there's just something about them that's very cozy to me, and I'm sure most of that is nostalgia. But I also feel like they have an energy to them, and it wasn't something that either of us had really seen in a lot of movies over the last decade or so, especially in Australia. As you can tell by my ridiculous accent, I'm Australian, and our film industry isn't all that it should be, at least in my opinion. Now, a lot of great Australian movies get made, but not enough get made. And if you go to any high school in Australia, literally any school at all, and if you asked a bunch of kids, like, what's your favorite film? Literally none of them would say an Australian film. Like, that's just the way it is. And that sucks to me, because when I was in high school and I was, a pretentious film buff, I love films from all over the world. And my favorite Australian films were all like 80s horror flicks, like Razorback. Like, Razorback's awesome if you haven't checked that out. And it's just weird to me that we were kind of growing up in a situation that Australian films weren't really marketed to us, weren't really made for us. A lot of Australian films you see are made with a particular audience in mind, and I don't know what that audience is, but they're getting made for that audience. Usually Australian films are about a dog in the desert, or something like that, and that's changing now, at least a little bit. But there's still no films being made that are really made with young audience, like young adults in mind. Comedies, fun things to watch with your friends. So those aren't really made all that often. And that's what we wanted Sweethurt to be. We wanted it to be a movie that you could get together with your mates and have a laugh. And so we wrote this movie about like a young guy, and he's feeling all sorts of regret about ending a relationship that he had, and so he goes on a road trip with his two best friends and his sister. And the pretense is that his grandfather has just died, and he has to go sort out the house. But his true motivations are eventually revealed, and that's his ex-girlfriend lives in the town, and he wants one last shot with her. And that's one story. The second story is about two other characters called Sky and Carly. And Sky herself has just been broken up with, and she's a bit of a sad sack, and her friend Carly takes it upon herself to make her feel better a little bit. And that's it. It's just about friends doing stupid shit together. And yeah, it's like that's sometimes that's all you really need from a movie.
I would agree. I did notice your little homage to the Breakfast Club in there with what was it, Drew's character? Yeah, Drew, who
Yeah,
Logan Webster
yeah,
plays,
yeah.
in there, and that made me laugh. You mentioned the sex comedies of the late '90s, and I did see a lot of that in here. That American Pie, Can't Hardly Wait, Loser type feel. I love Loser, and I'm a huge Empire Records fan. So when this came across my desk with a pop punk vibe, and I heard Mest play during one of the scenes, I was like, we're good here. Speaking of the music in the movie, what made you pick those songs, and what made you pick those artists?
Honestly, man, the soundtrack is one of my favorite things about the movie. So we knew going into it that we wanted that kind of vibe because the movies we were trying to emulate, always had that kind of soundtrack, and it's always been one of my favorite, genres. And so some of the heavy hitters from that era, like Third Eye Blind, we were lucky enough to be able to secure two songs from them, which was out of this world. Didn't expect that at all. But other bands like Mess, like you mentioned, there were so many evenings where Logan and I we just kind of sat here scrolling through albums and songs and trying to find the right fit for certain scenes. And we had, like, okay, if we can afford it, we'll get this song. And if we can't get that, we'll get this song. It had like lists. And it really was just a process of reaching out to as many bands as we could and finding who was cool and who wasn't cool. Because if they were cool, they'd say yes, and if they weren't cool, they said no. Or they just didn't get back to us at all. You have to learn to send emails and then never get a response. That's it's a very common thing that happens. But yeah, like we just found ones that we thought really worked, and if we were really married to that song, we would just keep hammering people with emails, and eventually we did get a music supervisor to help us out because, man, I was getting sent like contracts from like Warner Music and all these different record companies, and I didn't know what the hell to do with them, and I had to figure out all this stuff. Eventually, I just got someone like a professional to do it, and I just kind of hoisted off all the emails to her, and she had to kind of untangle this gigantic licensing mess that I had made. But one thing about film is that if you want to make a good one, you have to surround yourself with people who are a lot more talented than you are. And I don't have a talent for music licensing, and so I got someone who was good at it. But yeah, that kind of soundtrack always going to be a part of it. A lot of the budget went towards securing that kind of music because I knew it was one of the things that we couldn't really skimp out on. Some of the bands in the film, aren't as big as like Third Eye Blind or anything, but they had the right sound, and they had the right attitude. And so we could get away with getting some music that sounded really good, but we didn't have to pay an arm and a leg for. And I love doing that, because if I was in a band, which I'm not sadly, but if I was, I would really like it if a filmmaker came to me and asked me to use my music in a movie.
As someone who has been in a band before, I can tell you, we would love that. We would have loved it. I gotta ask you, that was a good use of how it's gonna be. Good usage. I love that song. But I gotta ask you, since we're here, who are some of your favorite artists? Some of your favorite bands?
Wow, dude, like when I was growing up, I was like a 70s classic rock kind of kid. Mostly because of my dad, because driving in the car, he'd be putting on stuff like Eric Clapton, Status Quo, all bands like that. But my brother and I were always into bands like Kiss, and I was really into Alice Cooper, David Bowie, all stuff like that. I still am, like my musical taste has never really pivoted from that kind of style. But as I've gotten older, I've embraced other styles as well. But when I was growing up, bands like Blink-182 were really popular, and so that really influenced my kind of musical taste as well. So I felt like I had this healthy mix of like classic music that I really liked, and then modern stuff that was really popular when I was growing up, like Third Eye Blind and Blink-182 and bands like that. But I've seen Alice Cooper in concert like 5 times now. I've seen Kiss, never got to see David Bowie, which makes me very sad. Seen Deep Purple, saw Eric Clapton, saw Iron Maiden, that was awesome. Saw Marilyn Manson. Yeah, I like to think my musical taste is pretty broad.
I love that because I'm a rocker guy. I'm from California,
Nice.
so
I can
growing
tell.
up.
I can just by looking at you, I can tell.
Yeah, everybody can. Got to ask you though, with making this film and the way that you structured it with the two parallel stories that are sort of parallel but are only connected very thinly, and that thin connection is only revealed toward the end of the movie. What was it like trying to put those together and make it make sense as far as the plot goes?
So, a joke that Logan and I often made to each other during the process is that our self-insert in the film is really Sky and Carly, which is funny because they're both girls, and that's just us kind of exploring an element of our own relationship of us being just real good homies. Uh, and initially, during the first few drafts of the script, the plot actually was a little more interwoven. They actually interacted with each other throughout the film a lot more, because there's the A story with Jacob and his group, and then there's Sky and Carly, and they kind of like crisscrossed throughout the film. But eventually we just kind of realized that the stories weren't that organically connected, and they didn't really need to be. It was enough for them to be loosely connected because the themes of each of the stories were quite similar, and we didn't necessarily need them to overlap in any sort of significant way, aside from towards the ending, which I think brings it together and makes it a lot more satisfying, because we only got like a couple of pages into those drafts before we realized that it wasn't really working out the way we envisioned it, and so we decided just to keep the stories mostly separate until the end, and we think it worked out better that way, and it allowed each of the stories to kind of foster their own identity, without kind of getting to that point where you feel like it's contrived that these characters are all interacting with each other. And like I said, it's much more rewarding at the end when they finally do.
I was gonna say, yeah, it made it for a more rewarding moment at the end of the movie when you see
Yeah.
that little thread. Speaking of that little thread, Dylan Lee has like the best comment in the entire movie because he steals the whole thing where he says, "Jacob is off fulfilling his destiny or completing his arc," and I was like, "Yeah, he is."
No,
Fair enough.
Dylan is so we met Dylan a couple of years ago for another project. We had auditions for this TV show we were trying to get off the ground. Never eventuated because Australia doesn't make fantasy TV, and this was a fantasy show, and everyone we pitched it to said like, this is really good. Unfortunately, Australia doesn't make this, and it's like, well, you could if you
They just
tried.
shoot all of
But
them there. They just
if it
shoot
sou-
all of them there.
if it sounds like I'm bitter, it's because I am. But putting that aside, but we met Dylan through that. And when we started writing this movie, we knew we had to put him in it because he's so charming and he's so handsome and he's so fun. And so we just called him up one day, and I was like, Dylan, shut up for a second. If you were to have a pet goat, what would you name it? And so he gave us the name Winston almost instantaneously. I don't know why he had that like in his back pocket, ready to whip out at any moment. But he gave us that, and we like to think that his character Max Cameron just wanders into this film from a very different movie, but he really he really is kind of the glue that holds the whole movie together, because he brings this element of absurdity and chaos to the film, and I think that helps with the more abstract and weird humor that the movie kind of gets into at certain times. And he's one of those things in the movie where all throughout the few test screenings we did with just like friends, family, or even like a couple of strangers because we wanted to get some honest feedback, he was always like the favorite. And we were like, then we should have just made the Max Cameron movie, but oh well, next time.
Yes, you should have just made the Max Cameron movie for sure. I agree. So last two questions are always the two hardest questions I ask anybody I get in front of me. First question is, who are some people you look to as inspirations, whether it be in filmmaking or outside?
So, the one that comes to mind almost instantaneously is Kevin Smith, because he's kind of the independent filmmaker's dream. Because he did what we all wish we could do, which was just pull together whatever resources you have, make something that's stuck together with gum you found under your own desk, and then it went made bank, and then it got out there and it had a huge cult following, and he built a whole career off this small movie that he made that was very unique. It had something to say. It was unlike anything else that was around at the time, and he made something that really set himself apart. And now he has a career that's spanned like 3 decades. Recently, now he's just doing podcasts and stuff, which is fine. I love listening to him talk, which is ironic, but considering he played Silent Bob. But
Yeah.
Kevin Smith, I think, is kind of the blueprint for a lot of independent filmmakers. So I would be remiss if I didn't cite him as one of my primary influences. But that also is mostly because of my brother, who was also a filmmaker. But he was the one who got me into Kevin Smith and really filmmaking in general. And unfortunately, my brother did pass away a few years ago now. He had leukemia. But before he did, he made his own movie, low budget, just his friends using our house as the primary location. And that too was just a romantic comedy, because he too was fashioning a movie after things like Clerks and like The Breakfast Club and stuff like that. All of the things in Sweethurt that I think make it good or made me want to make it, they had kind of had their genesis in my brother's film that he made so many years ago. And so I've always kind of viewed Sweethurt as a spiritual successor to this movie that my brother made. And you wouldn't know it unless you were me, but in the party scene in Sweethurt, for example, I got a couple of my brother's actors to be there and cameo. So in my mind, at least, they kind of share the same universe. So yeah, I would definitely Kevin Smith, but more so my brother.
Did you want to tell people the title of your brother's movie so they can check it out?
Oh, like there's no really way you can check it out. Yeah, I really can't stress enough how low budget it was. It was called Sick, though, if someone wanted to check it out on IMDb or whatever. I would love to somehow find a way to get it out to people. But yeah, as of now, it sits safely inside, the vault of my heart, and on burnt DVDs with scribbled permanent marker on them. That's kind of that's where it is now.
We'll take one of those. Thanks. No, before I get to my last question, which is the hardest question, I did want to mention, you mentioned Australian cinema earlier. I do think the horror genre is where it's been its best. I mean, Snowtown Murders, Lake Mungo is one of my favorite horror films. The Loved Ones. There's a lot of great Australian, and then of course anything Jennifer Kent wants to do is going to be good in Australian as well. So I mean, they've got stuff in there, but I think you're right. Outside of that horror genre, there's not a lot that I've seen. Really?
Yeah, I don't know why, but the horror genre is always kind of where Australia has nestled itself comfortably, and I would never say that we don't have something to offer in that regard. Like even recently, stuff like The Babadook, which is really, really good. I love that. There's stuff like Wolf Creek. That stuff has always found an audience, not just nationally, but internationally as well. It's always found a place. But beyond that, Australian cinema really struggles, and beyond film buffs, there's been very few films that are Australian that really make it mainstream. And the one exception is like Mad Max, but Fury Road, who's it starring, like Tom Hardy and Charlize Theron, like they're not Australian. Like the movie needed that kind of element in order to make it succeed overseas. And not just that, it's so like, okay, so I love Mad Max. Like Fury Road is like so fucking great. It's such a good action film. But why don't more movies of that caliber get made in our country? And even then, it was a legacy sequel to a film that came out in the 80s, like it had name recognition already. And it had George Miller as a director who's had a very long storied career. And he's beyond Mad Max, he's made a movie like Happy Feet. Like he's a very talented filmmaker and kind of turned his hand to any genre.
He also made Babe, and Babe's amazing.
Yeah, and Babe is great. And Babe is another one of those examples that managed to transcend its national boundaries. But yeah, man, like I just feel like more needs to be made. And to go off on a slight tangent, like you mentioned before, that a lot of movies shoot here, which is good. It creates a lot of Australian jobs. But I feel as though our screen industry prioritizes international production shooting here because they get a really nice tax offset. There's a lot of incentives to get foreign films to shoot here, but they do so at the expense of prioritizing our own films and our own movies that could use those resources. And you'll never see a movie on the level of like Thor: Love and Thunder or like any of the other Marvel movies that shoot here that really take advantage of the fact that we have all these resources that are also in and of themselves Australian, like an Australian cast set in Australia. For some reason, like there's just this unspoken agreement that no one really cares, and that's not true. I care. I want those movies to be made, and I want movies to be made that have enough, like they have the budget, they have the resources, they have the marketing to break into like to break our national boundaries and find success overseas. There's no reason why that can't happen. Someone just has to actually go and do it. And so Mad Max is a good example, but other movies can be made as well. Because like Mad Max wasn't even shot here,
No.
So when it's based on it's an Australian film series for sure, but when it's shot mostly overseas, you don't have Australian actors in it really, aside from a couple, and the filmmaker is Australian. But what else about it really makes it Australian? At that point, there's so few connections left to Australia that it just kind of becomes irrelevant, And so when you say to someone, "What's your favorite Australian film?" and they say Mad Max Fury Road, like that's a great answer, but like there's only a couple of those little check boxes that are ticked that really make it Australian. And that's annoying to me. I really do feel like more has to be done. And our screen sector, like Screen Australia, every couple of months they'll be like, we've put $2 million into funding for projects, but that $2 million is spread literally over like 30 things. So each project is getting like $5,000, or like that's not enough. Like I get that we don't have a huge like economy that matches like California or anything, but we're a big country. We have so much space. There's no reason why we can't focus on creating more Australian stories and Australian films. This is a sore subject for me.
I get it. Trust me. And like I said, the answer to your question is Like Mungo, my favorite Australian movie.
Yeah, no, Like Mungo, that's good.
It's funny. I'm actually interviewing one of Australia's best actor imports next week, so I'm looking forward to that. And we'll talk more about that in that interview, hopefully.
Nice.
I won't tell you who because I can't say.
That's okay.
but he's awesome. So my last question is the hardest question I ask all day. You can only watch 2 movies for the rest of your life. What 2 and why?
Oh gosh. Well, the first thing that just sprang to mind is Seven Samurai. You wouldn't have known it throughout our entire conversation, but I love Japanese cinema, and I've been working on a book for the last couple of years, like a novel, and it's set primarily in feudal Japan. And so in my research for this book, I've watched so much Japanese cinema, like it's actually absurd. A lot of that being samurai flicks. And Seven Samurai, always claws its way to the top of any pile when you're discussing Japanese cinema. There's just something about that film where it really doesn't matter how many times you watch it, you will find something new every time you do, and something new to appreciate. And if I'm only watching 2 films for the rest of my life, I'm glad I'm watching a film that's well over 3 hours long. So Seven Samurai it really has something going for it in that regard. But yeah, I really can't speak highly enough of that movie. If I had to choose a second one, I would probably I'd probably choose Jaws or Back to the Future. Both of which are probably the film I've watched the most. And since I've never ever gotten tired of them, it bodes well if I was only to watch one of those films for the rest of my life. Jaws has always been very close to my heart. I just I just watched it when I was a kid, and I was like, that is the greatest thing I've ever seen. And again, there's just something about it. It doesn't really matter that the shark in and of itself, you barely see it for most of the film, because Spielberg wanted to show more of it, but because it malfunctioned all the time, he had to find creative ways to get away with not showing it. But I think that works in the film's favor because it really I'm not sure if many of my contemporaries would agree with me, but it genuinely gets under my skin. The notion of something, in the dark where you can't see it that's coming to get you. Like that, there's something very primal about that. That's genuinely quite scary. And even towards the end of the film where you're seeing more of the shark and it becomes, more of a thriller, that's great too. Like I love the interactions between Hooper and Brody and Quint. Like it's just one of those movies that every time I watch it, again, I just find something new to appreciate. And Back to the Future is just straight up the film my brother and I used to watch the most, and I've never gotten tired of it, and I don't think I ever will. Back to the Future is just fucking awesome. I love it.
It really is. It is fucking awesome. It really is. I love that film. Who doesn't love Back to the Future? Like,
Yeah, and I once saw I went to there's a cinema here in Australia called the Hayden Orpheum, and they often do like film like trilogies or like old screenings of films, and they did like a back-to-back screening, back to the future, you might say, all three films one after the other, and that was great.
it sounds fantastic. I love that because that's my shit right there.
Yeah, they actually had a DeLorean outside the cinema you could sit in and take photos of. I was like, hell yeah!
You can't beat that. You can't beat that. So, gotta ask you, this is the last thing before I let you go. If people want to check out your movie, why should they, and where can they?
So they should, because I'll finally be able to prove everyone who said I couldn't make a movie that I definitely could. No, I definitely they should check out the film if they're a fan of it, late 90s, early 2000s comedies, or just comedies in general, because we really wanted to make the film's joke per minute ratio pretty high, and when there aren't jokes happening, we want people to feel something, because it is about love and regret and making mistakes and having friends around when you make those mistakes so they can make fun of you for the rest of your life. That's always fun. But I'm hoping that anyone who sees it finds something finds something valuable in it. Maybe they see a part of themselves, maybe they see a part of their childhood, maybe they see something of their young adult years, or when they're in their 20s, doing stupid stuff with their friends. There's something comforting about that, and for me at least, it's a time capsule of my own mid to late 20s, because that's when I made the film, and I'm hoping people get the same feeling from it that I get from it. And it's also, I know this is me talking, and I made the film, so obviously I'm a little biased, but I think it's really fucking funny. And whenever I watch it, I still find things to chuckle at, even though I'm so sick of watching it. I've watched it so many times now in the editing room. Oh my God, I'm so done with it. But even then, I find things to enjoy, and I find things that are really funny about it. And it's coming out April 18th in the US and Canada on like Apple TV, iTunes, Google Play, Prime Video. Sadly, I haven't found any distribution in Australia, which again just makes me even more bitter about the state of our industry. But yeah, if you can check it out, please do so. It's a good time. I'm sure you'll love it.
You heard the man. Check out the film when it comes out April 18th, which is literally next week.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for spending time with me today, Tom. We appreciate you. Have a wonderful rest of your day, bud.
Thanks, man. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Have a great day, man.
You too, man.